Okay, so I am going to show you what I did for capturing the user data and updating the DOM. Definitely in this case for me, I spent more of my time capturing the user data and then, sorry, capturing the user data and then also capturing it in a way that allows you to log into an external system, and in this case, as I've been foreshadowing for quite some time, into Firebase. Okay, so I went ahead and set up my Firebase. It's free for you to set up. You would need to add a project. This is very similar to the very first video I gave you on how to set up Firebase. And then I set up a project. And then once you go into the project to first work with authentication, it's pretty simple. You just go into the methods and then you enable. I'm going to start with email and password, but I know I definitely want to implement some of these other, what we refer to as federated, meaning you allow them to use that account to log into your system, your app. Okay, so and you can see here I've actually, and I'm going to go ahead and delete this user, I am actually able to create users with the current state of my output. So I'm going to first show you this. So here's my plan, is I'm going to walk you through my current state of my app, and then I'm going to walk you through how I implemented Firebase to our pattern, our module pattern. Okay, and as I foreshadowed in week 15 attendance, it was definitely a good exercise. I'm glad I chose to do this because it really brought some things crystal to my mind that I understood conceptually, but really helped me bring even more real. So here's my kitty cat match right now. Here's my login. I do have a couple of quirks I got to figure out. One is this: when I was styling my login buttons, something happened, and I haven't been able to, honestly, because I haven't spent a ton of time on it yet, be able to track down why that they do act like this. Anyway, something I know I need to work on. And this is very true when you're doing development. It's like, no, I know I got to work on this. And actually, this is where if you're working in a team, you would have issues that somebody was working on, so you would know who was working on that. And in this case, single developer, it's me. Okay. So before, where I was just mimicking login, this actually does log in. So I'm going to show you this. So I'm actually going to fill out, real data here. Okay, and then I'm going to sign up. And so when I sign up, once it gets through the process, boom, I get in, I get a log out button, and I'm in. So, but really, I'm going to show you this. I'm actually authenticated, meaning it handled the authentication on the side, on the Firebase side. So here is my UID, my unique user identifier, the date, and then just the provider we're using. Okay. So I do want to show you as well that the logout works. So I feel like right now I've accomplished something pretty great as far as my milestones that I wanted to achieve. So now let me show you how I did it. Okay, so in my code, let me stretch this out to the full screen so you're not having to look at something in the background. So as I said before, as far as my HTML, not much has changed. Although from the time I spoke with you last, I did end up implementing a form instead of just having a button there. I'm still working on a little bit of a quirk that I'm not sure where it's coming from. But other than that, this is my section called login, right, that shows up. And then I have another section that's gameplay. And right now, the section that's gameplay has that's the login section. That gameplay is not visible. I changed that to be a little more, declarative in sense that it's there. I did add the button in, which is something I know that I definitely want to work on, which is dynamically creating these things versus just having them. But I could get away with it in this case because I had the class of not visible, so it didn't show up. But I did have to implement, and I'll show you this, the log out to actually log the user out. So just to show you that. So I'll start with the so in this case I changed from, of course, the player data. So I could actually now get rid of, at least comment out the player data, because I implemented the remote player data. Okay, in this case, and then I set up the remote player data by instantiating the new remote player data, which we'll definitely look at in a minute. And then in this case, I ended up adding using three methods on the login handler, right? So this is the login, handle the login, then handle the create login handler, and then the logout handler. And I'll talk about what this is in a minute. So here's where, if you remember in the book, they were talking about the way, and I'll just move over for a second here to the way that, when you set up the function constructor for this, the way this is set up, you could use different selectors. I actually used that, and it was great to realize how beneficial that is. So here's what I mean. Let me go back to my main, is that so I created, of course, the login selector, which was the button I wanted to target for the event listener. So then every time I set up the new, in this case, instantiated the module or the method, I then use that different selector, right? So here's where that comes into play, but I'm using the same module. And that's great, because really once you're in the remote, right? So once you're in the login, so here's my different process login handler, create login handler, and then log out. Okay, so so this is similar to what you've seen, but different, because where the coffee run actually iterated over all the items in the form, I didn't. I will consider changing this in the future, because for the login, I only needed username and password, and then I just set up an array, and then I would then call array, and then I called fn. So fn in this case, if you remember in main, right, this is where I'm calling login player, right? So when you're setting up, so in new game, so in this case in the game, right, so this is just calling again. The reason you're doing this, and to see if, I know for me this is where I got that clarifying moment. This is separations of concerns, right? So only the game is interfacing with the player, right? So again, when I look at my structure that I had set up, so in this case, right, here's my add. So then if I actually now go to my remote, I will see, and we'll talk about some of this setup in a minute, but here's my add method. So this is for me to create. And I kind of started down this path talking about login, but they're the same in the sense of the way they're set up. It's just that you have different data and different things are happening, right? So you're calling, of course, the add function, and you're passing it the data. So the data in this case is coming from grabbing the looking at the get element by ID, the text of the email, which I'm going to change some of these names, because I realized some of this was from when I originally did it, and I didn't do a great job of naming. So anyway, I grabbed those items, then I had my data, then I just looked at it, and then I called fn, and I'll walk you through this again. Really, fn in this case, let me just go back for a second here. So is process login handler. So this is create, so the process. So when I process login handler on the main, so process login handler, here it is. This is where I'm calling that, right? So this, oh, I'm sorry, my bad. Login player, right? So it's calling first the process login handler, passing, getting the data itself, and then passing it into login player. That's what I was trying to say. Okay, so seeing how we're isolating, the back end of the user, of interfacing with the Firebase, and then it's only the player. The interface is with the the remote data store, and it's only in the main that we set everything up, right? So the separations of concern to me became real clear. And I don't know if it did for you, but maybe I'm not doing a great job of explaining it. So anyway, you can see that then here, this is a create login, right? But again, I'm using that same one here. So then I create that local variable, calling that again with a different selector, and then I'm calling create the login handler, getting the data, and then calling the create player, right? And then so the create player is here. So then here's the create player, and then this is the add. So here's my creating the user, logging in the user, and logging out. Okay. So those three work great. And so here, now that I just showed you that and showed you that it works, right? Now let me talk to you about the parts of the Firebase that I had to set up. So and this is really the idea, is that almost all the code for Firebase, except for one piece, is setting in the remote player data. Okay, so what I did here is I did set up, of course, right, the function constructor, and then for the remote player data. And in this, I'm just calling the initialize Firebase, which is this is just a cut and paste of the setup, the configuration, which I found there's another way to do this, so I don't have to include it in my code, but for now I'm going to leave it just so you can see it. And then check. So this calls here, and then it sets up. So, and these could be variables, but I just had them as constants, so I did that. And then it also does check setup, right? So it just checks to make sure everything's good and you're ready to go. So once you have these two, then the rest of these are the methods interacting with the Firebase. Okay, so that's the way I had to set it up. And of course, the other thing I had to do here is I ended up having to pass the Firebase around from this one into my main. So that's the other thing I did here, is because this thing here, which is way important, because this is anytime the authentication changes, meaning you're logging in or you're logging out, then this is, this, and actually this is probably not the best place to put it right now, but after talking to my friend Kyle and saying how we were setting this up, this is probably for now a fine place to do it. But this probably is going to end up somewhere else maybe later, maybe in the play, because that's my next step of this, to actually capture that user play data and write it to the database. And actually anyway, let me stop there and not get ahead of myself. But this is where, when the user logs in, this is how I change from the make the login section go away and show the game, and then vice versa when they log out. Okay, so that's how I ended up changing that. Okay, so let's see. The only other thing, so I showed you about, so I had to end up, again, I'm going to play around with this more, because this is, at least for now, it's working. And it's working the way I had hoped it would work. There's only, like I said, a few things I still need to implement. So let me tell you my next step, right? So now that I have, right, I can log in. The next thing I need to do is, let me remember that password actually. It's figure this out. The other thing is because now we're moving on to validation next. I had a little bit of a weird thing happen. I'll show you in a minute, but if I log in, right, so the next thing I want to do here is give some kind of summary of gameplay at the top. So, but in order to do that, I need to actually determine how I'm going to capture game score. So this is a major part for me, which is now, because I have, and I haven't even brought over the previous JavaScript that I wrote, because I don't want to yet. I don't want to focus on that. And that's the other thing I suggest, is really doing this, like getting certain functionality done. Because when you try to eat the whole thing at one time, you try to eat the whole apple at one time, it gets overwhelming and you're not sure the moving parts, right? That can really throw you off, which is why I've tried to break it down the way I have. So anyway, for me now, my next task, in addition to, as in here, right? So form validation, but I'll still be working on this because, as I said, this ended up taking more time than I thought, mostly because of implementing the Firebase and the way and the method and the pattern that we have here. Okay, so I want to show you the quirks besides the one just UI thing I have to fix, which I don't think will be that big of a deal. But here's the other thing that is kind of weird. Let me go ahead and log out. First, that I'm not sure why that's happening, which is that like it's going to here and it's hitting another submit, so I'm suspecting something on the submit handler, which actually might explain another thing that's happening. I'm going to refresh the screen real quick. Is that, remember the require? Let's go back and look real quick so we can see it for reference. So, and I implemented the require. By the way, I ended up bringing back the form so I could use the require as at least a first level validation using that constraint API. So by using the require, then on my submit, right, it should flag it, but it's not. And actually maybe something in my code that I just saw. Matter of fact, let's try it. It's always good to, once in a while try something and not, because in this case E is, I was thinking an event, but really this is actually a method event. Let's see if this actually fixes. Because do you remember what event dot default is? Because normally when you hit submit, it's actually trying to send something away to a server, but prevent default makes that not happen. So I think, let's see if it's broken now. Oh, so it's still broken. So what I mean by that is that it should be giving me here, that these fields are required, and it's not. But then what I realized is maybe it has to do with this, the fact that I was using on submit. But when I changed it to on submit, yeah, those required works, but then my Firebase stopped working. So that's the point that I get to do a little more, and so that wasn't the issue that I thought it was. Prevent default, I'm pretty sure that's the right command. So anyway, so my next thing, like I said, those are my quirks. I got to fix this. I got to figure out what's going on with that. I need to now, and by the way, that's my next thing here, is now that I have the user, right, which is awesome. Now I'm going to actually save, because I didn't do this yet. Let me just show you. So in my kitty cat match where I have first name and last name, I'm not capturing that yet because that's where I'm going to now implement into my, let's just show you, when I call the add right here, I will also grab that username and first name and last name. And in this case, I don't need them to create user, but I do need them to create, to add real-time database functionality. Meaning add them, create their UUIDs. So that's the next thing I'm going to do here, is I'm continuing with capturing that user data a bit more and then adding in my validation. But also important for me is the gameplay part. So I actually have some pretty big things I want to accomplish between here and the end, which is going back to what I talked about before and what I will end with today, why I said, and again, I know mine is a little more ambitious than maybe some of yours, but this is really where, right, really where we take hopefully so much of what you've been exposed to and what you've gleaned through all this material, and now you've actually hopefully going to translate that into skill. But anyway, just finishing up here, this is why I'm considering is instead of doing more free code camp is actually also continuing, again, leaving this as that as far as our grade goes, but actually having this be a substitute item and doing more development. And then ending with the last, because this is really where we end up with JavaScript, the weird parts here, is really, I think, good to hopefully, again, solidify some of these things. Okay, that's it for Develop at 6. Again, I know that not all of you, but at least over half of you, if I remember right, are going to consider using Firebase. You could absolutely implement a login with just the objects that are not the objects as we had done them in the coffee run, right? But those objects don't live on. They're not. What do we call that? There's a term for that where they don't. They're only good during the time your browser's open. So, and it works. I don't count off if you're doing it that way. I was just trying to show you a little bit more of what real world development is, because this is what, and especially if you're going to take Node with me next semester, we starting to leverage all these wonderful frameworks that are out there, because there's so much more you can do, right? There's so much more you can leverage by using what somebody else has already set up as far as services like Firebase, or as far as frameworks go. So anyway, that's where I'm at. Have a great one. Talk to you later. Oh, sorry. How are we submitting this? That's a good question. I mean, we've been doing print screens, so I'm not sure about that. So I will at least, I don't know. I'll think about that. I have a little bit to think about how. So when you look at this, you will see how I end up sharing. I might end up just sharing with you, and then have you just reply to, in this case, I think what I will end up doing is sharing my repo with you, because I can do that in our private repos, but then having you talk about, yours, and then at least give us some print screens or whatever you want to do, actually, on this case, to show us. But ultimately, when I grade this, I will go and look at your code. I haven't really done that in the last two. I've just more looked at your output, but on this one I will look at your code. All right, have a great one. Talk to you later. Bye.